She lied again, didn't she? My son whispered that after just one bite of the lasagna, my mother insisted was gluten-free. I believed her, just one more time. Now Ellis was sweating, shaking, clutching his stomach, and I held his hand knowing this would be the last time my mother ever touched his life. No yelling, no drama, just a look. And an ending wrapped in silence. Where in the world are you listening from? Hit subscribe for more true Reddit confessions that cut deep. I never planned to move back to Thornridge Hollow. It was the kind of town that didn't believe in therapy, or allergies, or boundaries. But when my father passed and my mother fell ill, I packed up my city life, grabbed my then 5-year-old Ellis, and came back to the house I swore I'd never enter again. She said she needed help, said she missed me. Truth was, she needed someone to fix her leaking roof and her loneliness, both of which she denied existed. At first, I tried to stay grateful. After all, she gave me life. That's what everyone said. You only get one mother. But they never saw how she smiled when Ellis flinched from her voice. They never noticed how she rolled her eyes when I pulled out his EpiPen. Or how she muttered things like, "Back in my day, kids weren't allergic to food, they were allergic to chores." Ellis has a severe gluten intolerance. One crumb can trigger a reaction that leaves him vomiting, sweating, doubled over in pain for hours. We've had 2 ER visits already. The last time he bled from the nose and couldn't speak for 6. But to my mother, it was all in his head, in my head. Just like when you were little, she'd say, "You were always so dramatic." I'd ask her, beg her not to cook with flour. She'd sigh like I'd told her to set herself on fire. Nay, so what am I supposed to feed my grandson Air? Eventually, I stopped asking. I started bringing Ellis's meals everywhere, labeled, sealed, doctor approved. And still, things happened. Muffins from a friend at church. Leftovers Ellis accidentally ate from her fridge. Rashes, swelling, a quiet boy growing quieter. I'd find her in the kitchen, arms crossed, saying, "You're turning that child into a bubble boy. Let him live." The guilt ate me alive. I started sleeping with one eye open, but I stayed because I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd come around. Maybe love would soften her edges. Then came Ellis's 11th birthday, and she offered to make something special. "It'll be completely gluten-free, I promise." She looked me in the eye when she said it, like she was daring me to doubt her, like this was the test. And I stupidly, blindly chose peace over instinct. I nodded, I smiled. I wanted to believe that this time she meant it, that this time she'd put love before pride. But love never poisons quietly, only power does. It wasn't the first time she said, "Trust me," but trust with my mother always came at a cost. A few months before Ellis's birthday, I caught her giving him a slice of banana bread. From Martha down the road, she shrugged, said it was made with almond flour. Ellis was being polite, and I had looked away for just a second long enough. That night, he broke out in hives. He curled into a ball on the couch, shivering under 2 blankets. His skin bloomed with welts like angry red vines. I asked her where the bread came from. "Oh, I might have mistaken the batch. You're always so jumpy." No apology, no concern, just a vague shrug and a turn back. After that, I started labeling everything. I had a color system, I triple-checked ingredients, I even left Post-its on the fridge. No wheat, no guessing, no exceptions. She called it neurotic. "You're raising a child who thinks the world's out to get him." "No, Mom." "I'm raising a child to survive a world that doesn't listen." But she didn't want to hear that. One afternoon, I caught her trying to reheat a frozen lasagna, her old favorite brand, full of wheat flour. "It's not for Ellis," she insisted. "It's just for me." Still, she left it on the same counter. The smell wafted through the kitchen. I had to explain again for the 100th time how cross-contamination works. She rolled her eyes. "You were just like this with your migraines, always so delicate." It wasn't just the food. It was the gaslighting. Then one night, I found a half-eaten cookie on Ellis's nightstand. His lips were swollen, his cheeks flushed. I rushed to give him the antihistamine, hands trembling, my mouth dry. "Baba gave it to me," he whispered. "She said it was just oats." That night, I stood outside her room for a long time. Her light was still on. She was probably reading one of her old cookbooks, pretending the 21st century didn't exist. I didn't go in. I knew if I did, something between us would break for good. So I kept the peace. Again. But peace in this house was a fog-thick, dangerous, and always one spark away from fire. Ellis became quieter around her. He stopped hugging her hello. He'd sit on the edge of his seat during meals, asking me silently with his eyes, "Can I eat this?" He used to laugh while eating. Now he paused before every bite. I hated what that did to him. To us, but still I stayed. Because leaving meant starting over. It meant pulling Ellis out of school, selling furniture, living in motels until I could afford a rental deposit. And because for a moment I thought maybe, just maybe, if she could make this birthday dish with care, maybe that could be the bridge. Maybe Ellis would smile again. Maybe I could look at her without flinching. I didn't know then. She wasn't making a dish. She was drawing a line. And daring me to step over it. The week leading up to Ellis's birthday, my mother changed her tune. She started being gracious, overly gracious. She offered to clean. She asked about Ellis's favorite colors. She even complimented the allergen-free snacks I ordered online, snacks she once called plastic disguised as food. "Let me make something just for him," she said sweetly. "I promise I'll follow your little rules." Little rules. That phrase snagged in my chest like a fishhook. Still I nodded, too tired to fight, too hopeful to run. She told me she was making lasagna. "But don't worry," she added quickly, "no noodles. I'll use those gluten-free ones you buy." She even asked to borrow the packaging to double-check the ingredients. I wanted to believe that meant something, that she was learning, that she was trying. But something didn't sit right. The night before the party, I found her in the kitchen, stirring sauce and humming. She hadn't hummed in years. The sauce smelled different. It smelled like before, like childhood, like flour. "Smells amazing," I said slowly. "What's in it?" "Tomatoes, garlic, basil, my old blend," she smiled, almost smug. "No secrets this time." But that was the problem. Her old blend had thickener. Usually all-purpose flour. I wanted to ask directly. But I didn't. I needed to hold on to the illusion, just for one more day. I watched her pour the sauce over the pasta like she was painting something, with pride, with memory, with defiance. The next morning, the dish sat on the counter, foil-topped, her handwriting labeled on the lid. Ellis, gluten-free, Grandma. I stared at that heart for a long time. Something about it felt theatrical. Performative, like she was setting the stage for a play only she understood. I asked if she double-checked the ingredients. "Absolutely," she said, smiling. "Even called the company. I care too, you know." She said it as though love could erase protein chains and molecular damage, as though intention mattered more than consequence. I packed Ellis's backup meal anyway, quietly, just in case. But she saw the insulated lunchbox and frowned. "And you still don't trust me," she said softly. It wasn't a question, it was a verdict. I didn't answer, not because I had none, but because the answer was already baked, already plated, already waiting to be served. Outside, the yard was being decorated with balloons. Inside, the air smelled of basil parmesan and doubt. And when Ellis came down the stairs, she held out the plate like a peace offering, or maybe a dare. The birthday started like any other small-town celebration. Streamers on the porch, fold-out tables in the backyard, lemonade pitchers sweating under the June sun, cousins running across the grass, tracking dirt onto the patio. I stood at the edge of it all, hands clenched, watching the world unfold like nothing was wrong. Inside on the dining table sat two dishes. One marked adults, One marked Ellis, gluten-free, Grandma. She made sure to say it out loud at least 3 times. That one's just for him. I was so careful. People smiled, nodded, complimented her for being such a loving grandmother. I watched her soak in the praise like sunshine. Ellis tugged on my sleeve. "Can I eat that one?" he whispered, pointing at the labeled plate. I looked at the label. I looked at my mother. She beamed. I looked at my son. His face held more maturity than it should have, like he already knew the answer. But I smiled anyway. "Just a small bite, sweetheart," I said. "Let's see how it feels." He picked up his fork, stabbed one square of lasagna, lifted it slowly, took the tiniest bite. Chewed twice, swallowed. The yard was filled with noise, laughter, music, camera shutters, but where I stood there was only the sound of my heart pounding. Ellis set his fork down. He didn't look scared. He looked disappointed. He looked at me with those tired eyes of his. Then he leaned in close, so close I felt his breath against my collarbone. And he whispered, "She lied again, didn't she?" My mouth went dry. My pulse dropped. I reached for his wrist, already clammy. Beads of sweat began to bloom on his brow. He clutched his stomach, slow at first, like a whisper turning into a scream. "It burns," he said, "inside." I didn't say a word. I grabbed his EpiPen, his water bottle, his jacket. We moved toward the house while the guests kept laughing outside. I passed my mother on the way in. She was holding a glass of wine. She didn't stop me. Didn't ask. Didn't move. Just watch me carry my child past her like he was a bundle of evidence she didn't want to touch. In the bathroom, he doubled over, gasping. I gave him the medicine, pressed a cool towel to his neck, held his hand, and waited for the symptoms to subside, for the rage to settle, for the truth to sink all the way in. As Ellis slept, I stood in the hallway holding the sealed bag of lasagna like it was radioactive. The guests were still outside. I could hear clinking glasses, the faint hum of a birthday song, someone joking about best food ever. I walked to the kitchen, placed the bag into an insulated tote, and grabbed my car keys. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Didn't leave a note, didn't even look at her when I passed. My mother was sitting on the couch, sipping her wine, legs crossed, smiling at a story someone was telling. She didn't notice me. Or maybe she did and chose not to react. I drove to the urgent care center 15 minutes away, parked crooked, and marched straight to the front desk. "I need this tested for gluten contamination immediately." The nurse blinked. "Ma'am, that's not a standard. It's a medical emergency. My son's symptomatic. He has celiac markers. I need confirmation." She looked at my face. Something in it must have silenced her doubt. She took the bag. I paced the small waiting room. Every chair creaked. The wall clock ticked too loud. A toddler cried behind a curtain. 20 minutes later, a lab tech came out holding a paper. "The dish contains traceable levels of wheat gluten," he said, "well above safe limits for dietary restrictions." I nodded, took the paper, folded it with care, slipped it into my purse like a legal document. No reaction, no tears, because I already knew. This wasn't about food. It never had been. It was about control, her need to rewrite reality down to ingredients, labels, and human bodies. Her refusal to be wrong, her belief that if she said something loudly enough, "It's gluten-free," then it became truth. I drove back slowly. The sun was starting to dip. The air smelled like barbecue and summer grass. As I pulled into the driveway, the guests were starting to leave hugs, songs, thank yous tossed into the wind. My mother stood by the doorway, sending them off with her usual southern charm. I stepped out of the car, paper in hand. She turned to greet me, that same sugary smile ready, until she saw my face. Until she saw the envelope, she opened her mouth to speak. But I walked right past her, into the house. Up the stairs, back to my son. That night I didn't sleep. I lay beside Ellis watching his chest rise and fall. His skin was pale, his breathing shallow but steady. I thought of the first time he got sick. He was 2. Ate a bite of wheat cracker at daycare. Within an hour, he was screaming, blood in his stool, fever spiking. I held him all night then, too. Back then, I blamed myself. I still do in ways that sting. But this wasn't a mistake. This was a choice. A betrayal dressed in a casserole dish, and I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. At dawn, I slipped out to bed, wrapped Ellis in a blanket, let him sleep on the recliner in my home office, away from the kitchen, away from her. I brewed coffee in silence, poured 2 mugs, hers black, mine untouched. I set them both on the table. She came down a few minutes later, hair done, lipstick fresh, like a woman preparing to deny the world. "He okay?" she asked too lightly. I didn't answer. Just slid the test result across the table. She glanced at it, scoffed. "That could be from anything." I pointed at the timestamp. She stared, her smile faltered. "You're going to blame me for every ache that child gets," she said, voice tight. I looked her straight in the eyes. "No, just the ones you caused." Silence, the kind that swallows every room it touches. I stood up, took her house key from the hook, set it beside her coffee. "You'll pack your things today." "This is my house," she spat. I shook my head. "No, it's mine now. You think you're the only one who loves him?" I didn't flinch. "You don't love him, you love control." She didn't speak again, didn't beg, didn't apologize. She just stared as if the daughter she raised had finally turned into someone she couldn't manipulate. And she was right. She had. She didn't leave that morning. Of course she didn't. She lingered, made breakfast like nothing had changed. Toasted bread, real bread. The smell of gluten filling the house like a final insult. I didn't say anything. I didn't react. But I was already moving. First I called my lawyer. We had spoken once before, after the banana bread incident. I had asked then, half seriously, how to take legal guardianship of Ellis's safety even within family. This time I asked him to file the official documents. The house deed still in her name was a technicality. My father had left it to her with stipulations any sale or transfer had to go through court, if deemed against the well-being of descendants. He died thinking she'd protect us. Now that clause would protect Ellis from her. I called the school, asked for a note on file. No release of Ellis to Delia Lark under any circumstances. I sent the medical report, the ER logs, the test result. They didn't ask questions. They just said understood. I changed the locks that afternoon. While she was out at the grocery store pretending to be useful, she came back with bags of ingredients, flour, butter, sugar. Her usual weapons of guilt wrapped in nostalgia. I didn't help unload, didn't speak. I just watched her struggle with the bags, and when she tried the front door, it didn't budge. "Is something wrong with the lock?" she asked, jiggling the handle. "No," I said, "it's just not your key anymore." Her smile cracked for the first time. "You're being ridiculous." "No," I said, voice low, "I'm being a mother," and then I closed the door in her face. Softly, deliberately, like sealing a wound that had bled for too long. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She just stood on the porch, bag still in hand, like a guest in a house she used to command. "You're humiliating me," she finally said, her voice trembling, but not with sorrow, with rage. I stood in the doorway, arms crossed. Behind me, Ellis was curled up on the sofa, reading a book about galaxies, his safe place always light years away from here. "This isn't about humiliation," I said. "This is about protection. You think I'd hurt my own grandson?" "No," I said coldly. "I think you already did." She dropped one of the bags. Sugar spilled across the porch like snow. Still, she didn't bend down to clean it. I made a mistake, but you're being vindictive. I tilted my head. Do you even remember what he said to me? She blinked, didn't answer. He said, she lied again, didn't she? I let that hang in the air like frost. That's what you've taught him, that the people who claim to love him can't be trusted. That safety is negotiable. That his body doesn't matter. Her jaw clenched. You're making this bigger than it is. No, you made it bigger when you baked him poison and called it love. She laughed bitter dry. You always were dramatic, ever since you were a little girl with those fake stomach aches. And there it was. The real truth, not about Ellis, about me. I saw it in her face. She never believed me either. Every childhood pain, every silent cry, every time I curled up in bed with no appetite, and she said I was being difficult. She didn't just deny Ellis's pain. She inherited that from how she denied mine. This wasn't just about him. It never was. It was the same war, passed down. And I was done bleeding from it. I stepped forward. I'll have your things moved into storage. You'll get the address. You're not coming back. You don't mean that. I've never meant anything more. She stared at me, searching for a crack, a weakness. A daughter, but I had stopped being hers the moment she decided my child's safety was optional. And I think for the first time she saw that, because she finally stepped back. Not because she agreed, but because she realized she'd lost. She left the porch eventually. No slamming, no dramatics, just the slow shuffle of footsteps retreating down a gravel path she used to own. I watched her from the upstairs window, watched as she got into her car, put her hands on the wheel, sat there for a long moment, and then drove off, no horn, no wave, no second glance. She didn't return the next day, or the one after that. I called the county clerk, initiated the formal deed transfer through the stipulation in my father's will. My lawyer filed everything: documentation of medical neglect, ER reports, food analysis, even Ellis's handwritten note. Grandma said it was safe. It wasn't. He drew a little sad face beside it. It broke me, and it strengthened me. I posted a public request on the town bulletin board, seeking part-time elder care professional, non-family only. I didn't explain, didn't owe anyone a story, but word travels fast in Thornridge Hollow. A few neighbors stopped calling. Some looked away at the grocery store. One woman from church left me a voicemail. I hope you realize how cruel you're being to the woman who raised you. I didn't respond, because the woman who raised me also trained me to doubt my own body, to silence my pain, to equate survival with obedience. Ellis didn't ask about her much, only once 3 days later, curled up in my bed after a bad dream. Is Grandma mad? I paused, brushed the hair from his damp forehead. She's learning, or I hope she is. He nodded. She didn't listen. No, I said, but you did. He smiled faintly. Can we have pancakes tomorrow? Only if they're gluten-free and dinosaur-shaped. He laughed. For real this time. And I held that sound like a small miracle in my palms. Later that week, I boxed up the last of her things. Found old photos, her wedding ring, recipe cards in her scratchy handwriting. On one scribbled beside the lasagna instructions she had written, for family dinners, always add love. But love without safety isn't love. It's a threat dressed as comfort. I folded the recipe card in half. Then in half again, and I threw it in the fire. Not in anger, but in relief. Because some traditions don't deserve to be passed down. They deserve to end. With you, the fallout wasn't loud. It never is in towns like Thornridge Hollow. It came slow, like winter fog slipping under your door before you realize the heat's been off for hours. At first it was absence. No more voicemails. No more unannounced stops with Tupperware trays wrapped in foil. No more just checking in texts from a woman who hadn't really checked in for decades. The porch stayed clean. The house finally felt like mine. But the town, that was a different story. Small towns don't need gossip to speak. They speak in looks, in pauses, in who doesn't get invited to the next church fundraiser, in who suddenly finds her usual seat at the PTA taken by someone new. At the bakery, the woman behind the counter used to throw in an extra cookie for Ellis. She stopped. At the market, the cashier no longer asked about him. She scanned my items without a word, eyes fixed on the screen. At the library, the children's section, once Ellis's refuge, felt colder. People didn't ask what happened. They asked around it. I heard your mom's staying with her cousin in Fairwater. She always talked about how much she loved Ellis. Is he okay now? I mean, really. And always beneath the words, you overreacted. You made it public. You didn't protect the peace. But peace that protects denial isn't peace. It's complicity. And I'd lived inside of that too long. Ellis, though, he was healing in ways I didn't expect. He laughed. Not just giggles, real laughter from the diaphragm, like he was shaking loose the ghost from his ribs. He started asking to help in the kitchen, measured spices, checked packages like a scientist. Double-checked that one, Mom, just in case. We made pancakes every Sunday, dinosaur-shaped, always safe. He started asking fewer questions about Grandma, fewer whispers at night like, is she mad at me, or did I do something wrong? He started drawing again. Planets, volcanoes, cats with sunglasses, little stick figures smiling, their hands always connected. His old drawings were grayscale. These were rainbows. And me. I got quieter too, but not from fear, from intention. I stopped explaining. I stopped defending. I stopped asking people to understand what they'd already decided not to see. One afternoon, the mailman handed me an envelope. No return address. The handwriting was familiar, stiff, formal. Inside was a check. $4,000 in the memo line. For Ellis, from Grandma. No note, no apology, no explanation. Just a number. As if grief could be refunded. As if betrayal had a price. I stared at the check for a long time. Then I walked to the shredder. And fed it through. Twice. Because closure isn't bought. It's earned. And I had already earned mine in silence and sweat, in every ounce of pain I chose not to pass on. Especially to him. A week later, we saw her. At the pharmacy. I was picking up Ellis's allergy medication refill number 5 this year. She was by the greeting cards, flipping through the thinking of you section like it owed her comfort. We locked eyes. She didn't speak. Neither did I. Ellis looked up at me, tugged my sleeve, and whispered, "Can we leave?" And that was all I needed. We turned, walked away. She didn't follow, didn't call after him, didn't cry, just stayed standing there between pastel card racks and the antiseptic scent of aisle 3. That was the last time he saw her. The last time I let her see him. Weeks passed, then months. One day, Ellis brought home a project from school family tree. He drew me, just me. Then added himself, and above our heads in a bright red banner he wrote, "Mom is safe." I stared at that phrase for a long time, not proud, not sad. Just quiet. It was the simplest summary of everything we'd survived. But the world didn't move on so cleanly. Some of my old friends' mothers, from town women I'd known since high school, grew distant. At birthday parties, I became the overprotective mom. At school, one parent pulled me aside and said, "I mean, it's just gluten. My kid eats dirt and survives." I smiled. Didn't answer, because some people confuse survival with love. And I'm not raising Ellis to settle for one without the other. A year later, I received a wedding invitation. It was from my cousin Lorna, one of the few who had sided with my mother. The envelope came with a handwritten note. I know things have been tense, but family is family. I didn't go, not because of bitterness, but because I was done performing at tables where safety was mocked as sensitivity. Instead, Ellis and I went hiking that weekend. He brought snacks he helped pack himself, laughed when we got rained on halfway through. We should have brought lasagna, he teased. Only if you make it, I smiled. He nodded. One day I'll cook something safe enough for everyone. My heart pulled at that. Because even now, after everything, he still wanted to include others. Still wanted to create, not erase. That night as he slept beside me on the couch, curled under our favorite blanket, I opened my journal. But instead of writing about her, I wrote about him. His bravery, his instincts, his ability to forgive without forgetting, his way of turning scars into stories. And I knew someday I'd let him tell the story for himself. But for now, I was still the keeper, and this was my final entry. 1 year later, I found the lasagna recipe. Folded neatly in the back of an old cookbook I was finally throwing out. It was her handwriting. Precise, almost surgical, as if ingredients could be controlled even when love could not. At the top corner, she had scribbled in red ink, "Make it for someone who matters." I held that phrase in my hands like a relic. Once I might have cried. Now I just stared, because the truth is she did matter. Once, she mattered in the way early roots matter, shaping how you grow, how you reach for light, how you learn to break the dirt and find your place above it. But not everything that plants us deserves to stay. Some roots rot. Some are meant to be cut. Ellis was upstairs reading aloud to his stuffed animals. I could hear him making voices, adding sound effects. He laughed freely, unafraid of being shushed. That laugh light and unburdened was all the closure I needed. I didn't burn the recipe this time. I didn't shred it. I tucked it back into the book, closed the cover, and set it outside in the donation pile. Let someone else decide what to do with it. Some stories deserve a quiet ending. Others deserve to be passed down. Ellis's story is just beginning, and maybe one day when he's older he'll ask more, ask about her, about why she's not in our photos anymore, why he doesn't remember her voice, why no birthday card came this year. And when that day comes, I'll tell him. All of it. Not to poison the memory, not to turn him against her, but to show him what choosing yourself looks like, what choosing truth costs, what love, the real kind, actually protects. Because I want him to know that safety isn't selfish. Boundaries aren't cruelty, and saying no can be the greatest act of devotion there is. If he ever asks me, "Mom, do you regret it?" I'll say, not for a second, because I chose you. Because there are two kinds of legacy. We leave our children, one is memory. The other is safety, and if they ever have to choose between the two, I hope they choose like I did, even if it costs them everything else. Because some lines once crossed cannot be redrawn, and some kinds of love should never be invited back in. Aita for cutting my mother off permanently. 1, yes, family should always get another chance. Member 2, no. A child's safety comes before blood. Has someone in your family ever crossed a line that made you walk away for good? Drop your story. Let Reddit decide. Subscribe for more confessions where justice whispers louder than screams.